Well, it is good to be with you. This is my third time at Chance. And what I want to do today is I want to tell you a story. Because I believe that every life has a story. We've heard so much about the story that Brian began. And really it wasn't Brian's story, it was God's story that He used Brian to tell. But yet Brian had to choose to be faithful and allow God to write His story. But each of you have a story as well. And God is calling each of us to be a faithful steward with the story that He has entrusted to us. So the story I want to tell you today is a story. This conference is about faithful stewardship. We know that God is faithful. In Psalms it says, feed on His faithfulness. But I want to tell you a story that is about 67 years in length. And we're going to try to do that in about 30 minutes before Chris comes up and shares another part of the story. This is a story that God began writing with my grandfather. So this is a multi-generational story. Back in the 1950s, my grandfather, Jaime Saint, was a missionary pilot. He was serving missionaries in the Ecuadorian rainforest. This story is told through books and movies, including End of the Spear, through Gates of Splendor, and many others. My grandfather, as he was flying, there was one area of the jungles that no other pilots would fly over because of the people that lived there. The people that lived there were then known as Aucas. Today they're known as Wauganis, which is their true tribal name. Now, these people had no contact with the outside world, and the outside world had no contact with them except at the end of spears. This society was an egalitarian society, so there were no laws, there was no hierarchy of any kind. But in order to understand the story I'm going to share with you, you need to understand this people. Living out in the jungles, though there were no laws, there did become 4 unwritten rules that everybody lived by. Rule number 1. If somebody does something that offends you, ignore it. Rule number 2. If somebody does something that offends you and you can't ignore it, kill them. Rule number 3. If somebody kills somebody in your family group, it's not only your right, it's your obligation to kill them and their family. Rule number 4. If you're going to kill somebody in another family group, take your whole family group with you, kill the whole other family group, that way there's nobody left to come kill you or your family. Anthropologists who have since studied this tribe said that there was a 60% homicide rate inside the tribe. They call them the most violent society to have ever existed on this planet that's been studied. But my grandfather believed that Revelation 7, see, God has written a story. And like my mom, when she reads a book that's suspenseful, she'll read the first chapter, then she'll read the last chapter, and then she can read the rest of the book because she knows how the story ends. But that's what God did for us. He wrote the end of the story. So we don't have to worry. If we allow Him to write our story, we don't have to worry about how it ends. But my grandfather believed that in Revelation 7, when it says that there will be people from every tribe and nation and kindred and tongue standing before God's throne, willingly giving Him praise. He said, how is this tribe going to know unless somebody goes? Because faith comes by hearing and hearing by the Word of God. So He put a group of men together, himself, Jim Elliott, Roger Udarian, Pete Fleming, and Ed McCauley. Young men. Ages 27 to 32. We've heard that thing, right? The younger generation, these were young men. My grandfather called these guys and said, hey, will you reach this tribe with me? In late 1955, they had located in the Amazon one clearing where some people from the tribe lived. And for 13 weeks at the end of 1955, they began giving gifts by what we call the bucket drop, where my grandfather, being a pilot, he had invented this, where he would lower a string with a bucket on the end from his airplane, and as he would fly tight circles, the bucket would hang motionless below the airplane. And if you ever get to watch End of the Spear, you'll see that taking place in the airplane or in the movie. And my dad's flying the airplane when that was being done. But after 13 weeks of both giving and receiving gifts, my grandfather said it's time to make contact. I just want one quote from his journals, which is really the part that impacted me the most. It says this. Now he was 32, the oldest of these men. Christmas of 1955. He said this. If God would grant us the vision, the word sacrifice would disappear from our lips and thoughts. You see, serving God is not a sacrifice. It's a privilege. Now, are there things that we may lose out on that we otherwise might have? Yes. Talk to Brian. Talk to Craig. Talk to probably all of you. But serving God is not a sacrifice, it's a privilege. In early January 1956, my grandfather had found a beach. I don't know if there's any pilots in the room. The beach was on the edge of a river, the Iwanguno or Kururai River. It was about 600 feet long, which, being a pilot myself, that's very, very short. He ferried the men in. They had prefabricated a treehouse to protect themselves from the wild animals, and they waited. On Friday, January 6th, out of the jungles came 2 young ladies and a young man. There was no animosity, there was no hostility. They spent the day there together on the beach. The young man, who they nicknamed George, his tribal name is named Kiwi, he got at least 2 rides in my grandfather's airplane. Later in the afternoon, the younger of the 2 ladies and the young man left. The older of the 2 ladies, who was probably in her late 20s, which was very old at that time by tribal standards, left just before dawn. I can only imagine that my grandfather must have been ecstatic, knowing the next chapter of the story, that they were going to be able to share the love of God with people who so desperately needed it. Saturday came and went, and there was no contact. Then on Sunday, my grandfather flew over the clearing, which was 2 ridges over from where the beach was, and he didn't see anybody. And as he flew back, he was looking down, but the rainforest has 3 layers of canopy, so you can't see down into below the trees. But the rivers that snake back and forth through the jungles. As he looked down, he saw some people coming to the beach, and he called my grandmother, who was always standing by on the radio, and he said, "Marge, it looks like they're coming for the afternoon service. I'll call you again at 4 o'clock. Well, 4 o'clock came, and there was no contact. My grandfather's watch had stopped shortly after 3 o'clock, as his body, having been pierced with many spears, including through his head, his body had been tossed in the river. All 5 men dead. How can this be? How can a loving God send obedient servants? All they were doing is obeying his call. Now all of them are dead. But you see, when God writes a story, he doesn't write every story in one chapter. Now most people at that time said, what a tragedy. What a waste. But you see, the God that we serve turns tragedy into triumph. That wasn't the end of the story. That was just the end of one difficult chapter. 2 years later, the next chapter began as my great aunt, my grandfather's sister, was invited in to live with the tribe. A young lady who had fled the tribe because of all the killings years earlier had been living with my great aunt. So my great aunt, Rachel, along with Elizabeth Elliot, the widow of one of the men, went in to live with the tribe. Now the tribe had no written language, and my great aunt worked for Wycliffe Bible translators. In order to translate the Bible, you have to have a language to translate it into. So she began working on that, and as she was living there, she heard about the killing raids, the spearing raids that would take place. Because they had to teach her, if a spearing raid happens, which normally was at night, you need to flee, and then here's how it goes. So what would happen? If a spearing raid would take place in a village, now they all slept in one longhouse. All the families, they were part of that family group. And what they would do is during a spearing raid, they would flee out into the jungles. And then after a few days, they would come back to where their longhouse had been burned down. And they would begin working in small circles. They got bigger and bigger, looking for the oldest male member of their family group's footprints. They knew not only everybody's footprints, but also their enemies' footprints from other family groups. And when they would find either the footprint or everybody had a unique carving, either on a tree or on leaves of a tree, they would follow those carvings, and as they went from one to the next, they eventually would come to where the father of that family group was. And when they got there, unless he was mortally wounded, he had already gone hunting and had already built a shelter for them. And so my great aunt used this as a way to communicate the gospel. She said, Utota, that's the son of Waingongi, the creator, he came to this planet. And he marked a trail for us to follow. So that as we follow his carvings, we call that the Bible, we will come to the place where he is. Where he has prepared a place for us. And he has food for us. Because out in the jungles they didn't wear any clothes. So if you had shelter and you had food, what more do you need? Well, in 1994, my great aunt died of cancer and was buried out in the jungles where she had lived the last part of her life for 36 or 38 years. My dad went down for the funeral. And after the funeral was over, the tribe told him through Dawa, who would be like a tribal aunt or grandmother to my dad, they had told him, you need to come and live with us. You see, my dad had started going into the tribe when he was 9 years old. And the man who killed my grandfather adopted my dad as his own son. When he had gone to my aunt, when my dad was just 9, he had said, how can Baba, that's my dad's tribal name, how can he be so ignorant? He doesn't know how to hunt, he doesn't know how to track. He doesn't know how to use a blowgun or a spear. How can he live if he doesn't know these things? And Aunt Rachel turned back to, her tribal name is Nemo. She turned back to Minkai and said, Minkai, you haven't killed this father. Who do you say should teach him how to live? And Minkai walked away. Because with those 4 rules, if he teaches my dad how to hunt and how to track, how to use a blowgun and how to use a spear, he's really giving him the tools and the training necessary to avenge his dad's death by killing Minkai or members of Minkai's family. But Minkai came back that afternoon and he said, it's true. Having spear killed his father, I myself will teach him how to live. You see, Minkai was no longer walking his own trail. There's only 2 trails, they say, in the jungles. There's your trail and there's God's trail. And they say when you come to the end of your trail, where are you? But when you come to the end of God's trail, He's there waiting for you with shelter and with food. So when the tribes told my dad, now that Nemo is dead, we say that you and your family, we had been down many times to the Amazon. Said, you need to come and live with us. My dad said no. He was a business guy. When Dawa turned back, he said, people, I've spoken to Waingongi. And I know that he sees it well. My dad had tried to use the North American excuse. You know, hey, I don't want to do it, so I'll pray about it. Because how does somebody else know what God has told you? But Dawa said, I've already spoken to the Creator. So my dad, thinking quickly on his feet, he said, okay, Waingongi the Creator and Ongi Kamo. That's my mom. Both of them seeing it well. Then we'll come and live with you. See, my mom was in Florida, and even if there was a way to communicate from the Amazon, 60 miles out from the nearest road, which is like 100 kilometers out, they didn't speak the same language. But Dawa turned back and she said, people, only Kamo being a Christ follower, if God sees it well, how can she not? So in 1995, 2 weeks after I graduated from high school, we moved out to the Amazon. And we asked the people, and we said, what do you want us to do for you? Because we thought missionaries do things. And they said, no, we don't want you to do. Foreigners are always coming and doing and doing. They come and they take care of our medical needs. They take care of our dental needs. They even will fly us from this place to another place if there's an emergency. But they said there are 2 problems. And as we get into this next part of the story, these you need to know. Problem number 1. When foreigners come, they only come when it's convenient for them, not when we have a problem. And 2, when they come, they can only meet a physical need, but our people have a bigger need. They have a spiritual need. So they said, you, being part of our family, if you will teach us what outsiders know how to do, we will not only be here when there's a problem, but as we take care of their physical need, we'll tell them how Jesus can fix their heart. That sounds good, but how do you do that? So then again, the next chapter began. My grandfather had been a faithful steward. My great aunt had been a faithful steward. My dad, moving us down there, it was the last thing in the world that I wanted to do. Today I wouldn't trade it for anything. But those 2 problems that the tribe had that led to the creation of a ministry called ITEC, the Indigenous Peoples Technology and Education Center. What we do at ITEC today is we develop tools and training systems, taking developed world things and changing them for a developing world context. Like a dental chair. A dental chair in the US weighs 300 pounds. Requires water, compression, power, but many places around the world don't have that. So we designed a dental chair that weighs 25 pounds. That can go on a backpack. And you can take anywhere in the world, including the jungles. But training systems, boiling the training down to what is necessary in order to do something proficiently, but not all the other details. And then we take those tools and training systems and we train Indigenous Christ followers around the world in those skills. The skills are small engine repair and maintenance. Film, because we said every life has a story. Recording those on film. Optometry. Medical care. Many places around the world, as you probably know, there are places where medical care is too far away to get in an emergency. Dentistry. In Africa, there's approximately 1 dentist for every 1 million people. So if you have a an abscessed tooth, where do you go? So we teach Christ followers how to do that. And then our latest one was farming. About 5 years ago, we had a team that came here and did a small engine repair for the team here on the base, as well as a film training. And we had several of our team members get trained in farming. And so today, because some men were faithful with God, were God in a tragic situation, but they were faithful to stay and to train. People that had taken their land and their farms. But now I can tell you it's our most requested training. We train farming around the world. Now, it was a need because most of the people that we train are pastors who are also farmers. But had these faithful men, had they not been faithful, you know what? We wouldn't be teaching farming. So iTech began. About 10.5 years ago, my dad had a spinal cord injury while testing a new tool that left him as an incomplete quadriplegic. He can't feel his arms, he can't feel his legs, and most of his body. And so then the next chapter began. As I was able to step into those leadership roles. You know, it was not, I never would have done this. In fact, it was the one thing that I told God. I said, I will go anywhere and I will do anything except work at iTech. You know what? Brothers and sisters, as we talked this morning, I would challenge you. Just have a deal with God. I'll do anything except this. And you know what? You're going to end up doing that. And today I can't imagine doing anything else. I've been at iTech for 12.5 years. I can't imagine doing anything else. I love what I get to do. I love the people that I get to work with. Today we have a team in Sudan that's doing a mechanical training and an optometry training. We have trainings coming up all over the world. South America, Africa, Asia. We've done trainings in Europe, in the Middle East. We have trainings coming up in North Africa. Why? Because all the way back, 67 years ago, some men were willing to say yes and were willing to be faithful. But there's so many other stories that I could tell you out of this story. But I want Chris, who is the Director of Multiplication or Equip at iTech. Equip, I said develop tools and training systems, train indigenous Christ followers, and then we equip others to do the same, both domestically and around the world.